All right.
Right. So we're going to be going over the Amish tonight, which is a quiet and committed denomination. There are about 383,000 individuals that are considered to be in the communities, but that doesn't necessarily that they're a part of the church. There's actually 172,000 that are considered to be baptized within and a member of the church. There's actually a really large Mennonite population that live close to or around Lafayette, and groups will primarily reside in Ohio, Pennsylvania, and Indiana. They take a literal interpretation of the word and also a hermeneutic approach, which means that they focus primarily on the New Testament. They're identified mostly not only as a people group, but also as a religion, similar to Israel. So they have a faith in everything, but they are also associated with the group and the people that they are part of, and they make communal decisions as a church, and we'll kind of talk a little bit more about that. So a history, this kind of began in 1517 when Martin Luther hammered his 95 Theses to the Catholic Church door. This began the Protestant Reformation, and we see in 1525 the Anabaptist movement kind of began from this. That started a 160-year persecution from the Catholic Church, and we see the beginning of the Anabaptist movement with the 1660 Martyrs' Mirror written, which kind of records the persecution of just the Anabaptist group at this time. And then in 1632, the 18 Articles of Faith, or the Dordrecht Confession, was written, and that kind of establishes some of their beliefs in faith, almost like a foundational belief system. And then in 1685, the Protestant Church was moving around, and that kind of established a way that there was an expansive movement of the church across the Central Europe there. And in 1693, there was a revitalization effort in France from Jacob Amann, which is kind of where we get this Amish term for, and we had a split from the Anabaptists to the Amish and the Mennonites. This established the Amish as the old order and then the Mennonite church. That used to be just the two denominations until we see in 1920 to 1950 some tension kind of split up the old order into Beachy and old order, so we had that along with the Mennonites, and then new order eventually split from the old order as well, and we'll kind of talk about a little bit of why. So these subgroups and everything are kind of the things that we see established as the Amish. So all of these things are considered Amish, but there are two groups that consider themselves true Amish, which is the Old Order and the Mennonites. So the Old Order kind of believes that there is no assurance of salvation. They believe it is prideful to say that you have a complete assurance of your faith and belief that you'll be going to heaven at the end. They have a hope for this assurance of salvation, but they say that it's prideful since you are not there, and we are human, make mistakes, and still sin, so they don't have that assurance of salvation, and they also hold a strict traditionalism and legalism in terms of their faith and how they abide by these things, and they completely reject modern conveniences. So we see when that split happened in 1693, from the Old Order, the Mennonites established, and they kind of established that over shunning. They decided that the Old Order church, the Amish basically, they had really strict shunning and excommunication things. So if somebody joins the church and they break their baptismal vows, they're no longer allowed to be part of the church, and they're shunned from their family, which means they're no longer allowed to eat at the same table as them. They cannot go to church, and then until they decide to repent and be rejoined back to the church. They also have a lot more modern acceptance to conveniences that we would take today. Most groups, typically the Mennonite, also allow them to drive cars. So the Beachy kind of split from the Old Order later on in 1920 to 1950, and they decided that they kind of wanted to have some of these more modern conveniences, but they still have a lot of beliefs similar to the Old Order. A lot of these things don't necessarily hold true for each of the church here, because a lot of the churches establish their own beliefs. And as things change, for example, a new preacher is inducted or whatever else, their beliefs can fundamentally change. So this is just a broad belief spectrum of what these subgroups could hold typically. So New Order was the last to divide from Old Order, and they actually truly teach salvation by grace through faith alone. And they also have a liberal acceptance of modern conveniences. There are very few Old Order churches left in the US today, but there are some kind of scattered across the world. We see mostly Mennonite and New Order as well today. So we have a little bit of those extra biblical liturgies that we were kind of talking about across that time frame there. So in 1660, the Martyrs' Mirror records persecution that happened. And a lot of the reasons that we don't see a lot of Amish evangelizing today is because of the heavy persecution, literally almost to the point of annihilation, when the Catholic Church began this initially. And this photo is actually from the cover of one of the rewritten versions of the Martyrs' Mirror. The 18 Articles of Faith were written in Dordrecht, Holland in 1632, and they're the confessions of faith for baptism into the church, but that is not the only thing that will allow them into the church. The Asbun is actually a 16th century collection of the imprisoned Amish. They were writings, and though they are not written in any kind of song form or hymnal, they're the modern day songbook for the Amish, and they typically reject most other types of song. The Ordnung is actually really interesting, and we'll kind of get deeper into this. These are the unwritten vows of commitment to baptism individuals must make before they're accepted into the church. These vary between the church greatly and are established typically at spring and fall communion. They only do it twice a year, and right before them they decide if they're going to continue with these baptismal vows or if they're going to change them, and it is typically very strict and requires lots of consideration within the church to be able to do so. Like I said, these are rules on living separately from the world. They take that very literally. So the Ordnung, they consider these things as living within limits, because if you're not able to live within limits, it kind of defeats the whole purpose of being able to live for Christ in this day and age. So these things establish rules on clothing, media, technology. They're not allowed to have any electricity in their homes, and they're not allowed to tap public sources for those things. There are some groups and everything that will allow you to have gas-powered generators, things like that, but they believe that they must own and own no debts to anyone at any point in time. So they will purchase their own gas and have and own the generator at that time, and so everything that they are using is their own, and this also varies by church. Some reject it completely. Other things that they will establish on or include leisure, public organizations and service clubs. Individuals that have served in the military are never allowed to join the Amish. They also forbid tattoos. If you're going to be able to join the Amish, you will have to either get them burned off or literally removed. They'll establish rules about furniture, dress. Women must wear the traditional dress and apron, and also head coverings. Head coverings in the church are actually very specific, and we'll kind of get a little bit more into that. The Mennonite are allowed to drive cars, and some other groups are allowed to drive cars as well, but those that reject cars as a modern convenience drive horse and buggy. And reasons that they would choose to reject some of the modern conveniences is in their communities they kind of bring these things to the meeting before the spring and before the fall communion times. And they'll decide if these things are going to be able to draw them closer to God or if they will draw them away from God. And they make these decisions as a church and as a community to see if these things will be helpful to their faith or draw them away from it. So Rumspringa is actually a really interesting topic. This is a really sensationalized topic that we see a lot in like our own media, and it's called running around literally. So it begins around 16 years old, and individuals will decide if they would like to be baptized and join the church or if they will leave the Amish, which is actually a really significant thing if people choose to leave the Amish, because this is a way of life that they were raised into, that they were grown up in, and cutting these ties literally means that they would be able to walk into the world without any kind of support in a world that they basically don't belong to. So in order to end Rumspringa, they either get married or they decide to join the church at the end of the day. And if they don't get married, they will join between their mid to late 20s. Basically, they're able to experiment with anything that they would consider the English way of life. They consider their way of life as the Dutch, and we are the English because we speak English. So the more liberal type will get very into Rumspringa. It is their experience of the world while they're able to experience, not under any kind of vows to the church that will drive them away from the church. Otherwise, some are forced to not undergo Rumspringa, or it is so subdued that they're not able to experience these things for themselves and to choose the life that they want to. And some more of the conservative ones, if they even do Rumspringa, will have Sunday night services after church that they may or may not hold. So more sources of life will actually lead to church membership, and they say that this strengthens the willingness of individuals to join the church in the end. So what they believe about the Trinity, this is kind of interesting, and this is a very general belief, obviously, because all of these churches establish their own beliefs at the time of a new pastor induction, and they kind of do pastoral inductions very interestingly, and I'll kind of go over that real quick because we didn't get to go over it when we were talking about the Ordon. So the way that they introduce pastoralship into the community or elders or anything like that, they announce in a community that they will be electing a new pastor or a new elder, and they will bring it to the church within 2 to 3 weeks. And they will be able to pray over these things as they hold church every other week. And individuals that are allowed to vote in the church are only male, and they must whisper basically the names of those individuals that they see fit to be able to lead a congregation. They will whisper these names into the ear of the present elder or the present pastor. and anybody whose name was mentioned more than 3 times will be considered for the position. And there are some groups that will put all of those names into a hat. Whoever's name is out of the hat drawn, that is a new pastor or elder. Or they will put a slip of paper in a book, and whoever gets the book with the slip of paper will become the new person. So that can get really interesting of who's actually qualified for those sorts of things. So obviously, when we have those individuals deciding what a church believes as a whole, that can cause some different beliefs and structures. So the Mennonites believe that we worship the one holy and loving God who is Father, Son, and Holy Spirit eternally. Other groups believe that God is 3 separate entities, but all one in person. So we kind of see that in the Southern Baptists. We believe that God is one in 3 persons, not separate, but each have their own distinct personal attributes. Over here at this bottom belief set, it means, or they're kind of inferring here, that all are separate and have their own personal distinct abilities, yet they are all in one technical God. So that kind of gets a little interesting and could be a little bit confusing, but this group kind of considers them to be separate, yet all God, and this group considers them to be together and all God as well. So, beliefs about salvation, we kind of touched a little bit on this. The Old Order has a hope for salvation and no assurance of it. New Order believes salvation by grace through faith. And BG kind of varies by district, obviously by church as well. So churches are kind of organized by district, and we'll get a little bit deeper into that. But they primarily have faith like the Old Order. The Mennonite kind of believes the closest to what we believe, as in salvation involves the redemption of the whole man, and is offered freely to all who accept Jesus Christ as Lord and Savior, who by his own blood obtained eternal redemption for the believer. There's no salvation apart from personal faith in Jesus Christ as Lord. So, baptism is actually a very, very significant part of the Amish community, and they hold very specific beliefs and very, I guess, distinct. They're very protective over their methods of baptism and hold true to that. So baptism is considered a membership into church. So it is a very specific commitment. You must be able to speak Pennsylvania Dutch or German, whichever the church speaks, because if you do not speak that language, that is the only language that the service is held in. You must agree to live by the ordinance, where it says those unwritten rules, and they take a 2 to 3 week course to be able to walk you through so that you know and almost have those memorized and everything to be able to live by them. And this is your pledge to the church. It's your sign of repentance and your baptism into Christ. It's also the symbolism of the believer's faith. So in order to be baptized, you must agree to live by all of these things and must be able to speak the language. They will do pour-over or immersion baptism. It just depends, because these communities hold their churches in believers' homes, essentially, or barns and everything that are local. They believe that it is absolutely useless to have a church building that requires things to be upkept and paid into, when they can just hold it in community and have house churches similar to how the New Testament church was first established. And so they may or may not have a source or active running water that they're able to go and immerse a believer in, but they still hold true to their commitments of baptism and what that significantly means. Breaking of vows is really different among the churches and everything and what they believe. So breaking of vows means that you have broken your vow of baptism, which in some churches will lead to shunning and excommunication. There's some beliefs that you are able to come back into the church after you've broken your vow of baptism, approximately 3 times, and others, once you break your vow of baptism, that you are no longer allowed back into the church. And there are others that once you break a vow, they are desperate to keep members and everything, will do everything that they can in order to keep members back in the church. So this kind of varies, but breaking of your baptismal vows is a very significant part of disobedience in the church, and they encourage repentance by shunning. Essentially, it's supposed to draw the believer back into obedience to God. So their denominational structure is kind of different. So their districts are organized by their ability to travel. So if you drive by car, if you're Mennonite, and some Mennonites actually have churches, not just visiting in churches in believers' homes and everything. So districts will vary by size, by ability to travel. Some will travel by horse and buggy, which can lead to a very significant travel time. So they'll organize churches by district of feasible travel. Right below the church and everything is considered the pastors, and then the elders and the church body itself. And there's a hierarchy in the church itself. So in order to enter the church on a Sunday morning, first the pastors will enter, and then the elders, and then the men of the church, the women, the young boys, and then the young women. There's a very significant hierarchical structure in the church that these believers strictly adhere by, and there's a very significant gender divide between these two things. In Southern Baptists, we actually got to learn a very significant amount about this. We have local ministries that contribute to the convention and everything. There are state conventions, there are national conventions that these ministries will contribute to, and once a year held annually is a national convention, where local ministries will elect messengers based off of the size of the church and the amount that they can give to go to this convention. And basically there's a president that presides over the convention, and based off of topics that are current or going on in the church that they're considering, they will give guidances to these churches about how to apply what's going on in daily life to guiding and leading their churches. These messengers will come back from the convention at the end of it, and they will decide as a church how to apply these guidances. There's a lot of autonomy of the local church, and they decide how to apply these things, if to apply them, and what that looks like, and to the degree and extent. So the role of women in Amish. In early history, women of the Amish were actually very empowered and very free. They were considered a priesthood of all believers, and that led to a lot of freedoms and active involvement in sharing their faith. In 1823, we saw a lot of social work, involvement in 1905 as deaconesses, which was kind of a mixed feeling of practice, because they were technically ordained for ministry, but they were not allowed to hold any kind of office or authority in the church. And yet they were establishing churches where they were, and that sort of thing. So kind of a mixed feeling practice, especially depending on the church. And then in 1917, we see at least 1/4 of all of the ministers in the Netherlands were women, which is actually a really significant number of people that were involved in things. Elizabeth Dirks is actually one of the biggest women that was in the Amish community that made a very significant contribution as a missionary. And she's actually very held and very esteemed in the community, despite all of the things that have kind of transgressed down into where we kind of stand today as women that are Amish. In terms of head coverings, women that are Amish, typically in Old Order especially, have to wear a head covering as a sign of submission not only to their husbands, but if they are not married, to their fathers in their own homes. The Mennonites consider their hair to be their own head covering, and some will wear doilies, but it kind of comes down to the interpretation and the cultural aspect of that passage of the Bible. They're not allowed to have pastoralship, and that's kind of even through the early history, but we've kind of stepped down today in the church to men conditioning women to believe that their primary duty is motherhood and household care. They consider headship for a husband, silence for women in the church, and primacy or normativeness of the male experience to characterize most Mennonite gender roles in teaching and practice. This is based on androcentric or male-centered interpretation of Scripture, and both men and women have neglected hearing Jesus' first call to all, to hear God's will and to do it. We kind of also see this in today. We don't see a lot of evangelism with the Amish. They typically stay in their communities. They don't really interact a lot with the outside world, and a lot of this is due to the persecution that they first experienced from the Catholic Church. This also kind of came and became more established when we see a lot of the hellfire brimstone type preaching that kind of came in. This is a very pacifist, very against violence type denomination. They are not allowed to have firearms in any of the subgroups of the denomination. And so preaching that can be aggressive or considered coercive in a way is very frowned upon, and they prefer to live their lives and their evangelism style to be an example to others. And these individuals will see that their way of living and everything is a light unto others, and if they're curious about it, they'll ask, and they will speak and share their faith freely when they're asked. So. Some of my kind of takeaways from this is I really appreciate their commitment to a foundational faith life, and I think that we should really consider our own priorities and our own faiths in these things. I don't think there's any of us that really consider our own modern conveniences, and if those things draw us towards God or draw us away from God. So I really appreciate these things, and while I have some concerns for salvation's consideration for the Old Order, I truly believe that their hope for an assurance of salvation, everything really leads them to be living in obedience to God quite frequently more than we would typically see in our own churches today. So while I have concerns for this, I still deeply admire the fact that they are committed to the way that they're living in obedience to God. I do have a lot of concerns over doctrinal whims of ministers who may or may not be equipped to be leading their congregation, especially with the way that they are kind of inducted into ministry, which can also vary between church. But that kind of leaves me with some concerns for those sorts of things. But if they are typically living in obedience to God, I still think that there's a possibility that they could be leading these churches very well. I think that we kind of see this today as well in our own churches. We have a relationship with God versus cultural standards. So these individuals have grown up in a community where faith has established our way of life, where praying basically regulates the day, and then every other week we have a Sunday church that we go to. We drive horse and buggies everywhere. So it is almost a way of life that they are drawn into and is expected of them. And for them to be able to leave, or for them to leave this church requires a lot of very significant consideration and almost abandonment of everything that they know. So joining the church sometimes can be easier just because it's something that you do naturally than actually having a relationship with God. Some kind of comparison to our own is, okay, you grew up, gone to church, you know, it was a natural thing that you were able to do. We just typically have a lot more access to leave the church on our own versus establishing our own relationship with God. So that's something that I think is also important to think about. In terms of evangelism, I feel like they were really at the forefront in activism for this at the beginning of their establishment, but I feel like their approach to evangelism today could really see some revitalization compared to what they were originally at, and I think that that would be really interesting to see in today's day and age. And I also think that some of the extra biblical standards for church membership can kind of be a deterrent, but this is also an established way of life for them, and drawing away from those things could be a fundamental change to the church. So that's kind of what we have for the Amish. Do we have questions?
So between a pastor and an elder, what's the difference in like the role or responsibility there?
So it's kind of similar in terms of pastors and elders to similar to how we would see today and everything, and elders would be giving advice and guidance to the pastor, and we don't see, it's very similar to like a deacon type role. So
could you explain the Mennonites again?
sure. So we'll go back up here. There we go. So what are you cutting clarification-wise?
Well, just kind of the differences between the
Sure.
groups.
So the Old Order and the Mennonites consider themselves to be, quote, true Amish. They are the first original denominations, and we really don't see a lot of division from those two denominations until the 1900s. From a faith that was established in like the 1600s, that's a pretty significant amount of time. The Old Order basically believes that they don't have any assurance of salvation, and they hold to strict traditionalism and legalism. They reject modern conveniences versus the Mennonites. And the Old Order also believes that shunning and excommunication are ways to draw individuals back into the church if they are straying from God. The Mennonites truly believe that shunning and excommunication, heavy rules and regulations about that, are not necessarily the best ways to draw individuals back into obedience of the church, and so they will allow the individual to still be in the church and everything despite having broken their baptismal vows. And they also have a lot more acceptance to modern conveniences, like they're allowed to drive cars versus Old Order Amish will drive horse and buggy, and if they allow the community to be able to have access to a car, they are only able to be driven around by taxi or by individuals like children who have left the church and everything to be able to drive to things like medical appointments. So.
Okay, thank you.
One of the things Mennonite, even though they are allowed to have vehicles, at one point I do remember that they only are allowed to have black vehicles.
Mm-hmm. Black and white typically is what we usually see in that, yeah. That's actually, it really also varies by church, so, yeah. Go ahead.
With like breaking the baptismal vows, does that mean like you have messed up a little bit on what the ordinance says, or does that mean that you've done something major? Like, what does that look like?
Yeah, so typically breaking of a baptismal vow is usually something over, we see it a lot with individuals who are prone to violence or abuse in relationships, who are drunks and have a reoccurring problem of this. Like, typically it's not like, oh, you know, somebody tapped electricity or something like that. Like, they don't even have typically electricity like wired into their homes. So it really just kind of depends on the church and the severity of the elders. Shunning can be lifted only by the elders and everything of the church. And so for those things to be kind of regulated by the elder, it really depends on how strict the elder is. There are some communities where individuals will truly like pick up everything that they own and move to another district for elders that are really severe and harsh in some of their punishments and their enforcement of the shunning rules, but there are also some that are really liberal, so it depends.
I know that you talked a little bit about like the women and like some of the clothes that they have to wear, like coverings. Is there anything with like men and like what they have to wear, like any standards?
Yeah, typically men will wear a button-up shirt and a hat and some form of pants and everything like that. Head coverings can be a little bit interesting there. There are some groups that truly believe that they have to have their heads shaved and they're not allowed to wear hats in church because the Bible speaks on that same passage and everything that women are supposed to have their heads covered and men are not allowed to pray without, like pray with something covering their heads and everything with the hindrance of God. So there are some that forbid, having men with hair on their heads and everything, just for that like barrier and head covering between them and God. So it really just depends, but that is typically part of that traditional dress. So. Is there any other questions? Okay. Well, thank you guys.